The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Bitter Creek as Clara Morrison stepped down from the weathered stagecoach, her worn leather boots touching the hard-packed earth with the careful grace of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the ground beneath her feet. She appeared to be a woman in her late 50s, her graying auburn hair pinned back in a simple bun beneath a modest blue bonnet, her traveling dress practical but well-made from quality fabric that spoke of better days. The leather satchel she carried showed years of use, its brass buckles tarnished but sturdy, and around her neck hung a delicate silver locket that caught what remained of the dying light. Clara paused to survey the town, her steel-gray eyes taking in the ramshackle buildings, the hitching posts lined with horses that had seen better days, and most prominently, the broken-wheel saloon that dominated the center of the street like a wooden fortress against respectability. The establishment buzzed with the kind of rough energy that came from men who worked hard, drank harder, and respected little beyond the strength of their own fists. Through the batwing doors, she could hear the discordant notes of an out-of-tune piano mixing with raucous laughter and the occasional crash of breaking glass. She had been traveling for 3 days straight, changing coaches twice, and every mile had added another layer of dust to her clothes and another ache to her bones. All she wanted was a hot meal, something stronger than water to wash the trailed dust from her throat, and perhaps a quiet corner where she could rest her weary soul before continuing on to the Morrison Ranch that waited another day's hard ride to the north. The ranch her late husband Thomas had left her, the place where she had once been known by a different name, where her reputation had been built with blood, sweat, and the crack of braided leather. But those days seemed like another lifetime now, and Clara Morrison looked like exactly what she appeared to be. A tired widow making her way through a hostile world with nothing but determination and whatever modest fortune remained in her carefully guarded purse. Inside the broken wheel, the conversation had already shifted to speculation about the new arrival. Big Jack Malone, a mountain of a man with shoulders broad enough to block out doorways and fists the size of ham hocks, leaned back in his chair and studied the woman through the grimy window. His weathered face, marked by a jagged scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, split into a cruel grin that revealed teeth stained yellow by tobacco and years of neglect. He wore a black leather vest over a dirty white shirt, and twin Colt revolvers hung low on his hips in well-oiled holsters that had seen plenty of use. "Jack, there is money walking our way," said his lieutenant, a wiry man named Pete Hutchins whose nervous energy made him constantly fidget with the brim of his hat. Pete had the kind of face that looked mean even when he smiled, with close-set dark eyes and a thin mustache that he kept twirling between his fingers. "Look at that locket, that dress fabric. She has got to be carrying a fair amount of coin." The rest of Jack's gang nodded their agreement from where they sat clustered around 2 tables they had pushed together near the center of the saloon. There was Carlos Mendez, a stocky man with burn scars covering the left side of his face from a branding iron accident years ago. Tommy Fletcher, barely out of his teens, but already with the dead eyes of someone who had killed without hesitation. Frank Wilson, whose massive frame made even Big Jack look small, though his childlike face belied the vicious cruelty that lurked beneath. And Silas Grove, the oldest of the group at 45, whose gray beard and calm demeanor made him the closest thing they had to a voice of reason, though that reason rarely extended beyond calculating the best way to rob someone blind. If you are enjoying this tale of a woman who would prove that appearances can be deadlier than any weapon, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Comment what country you are watching from, because I love seeing how these stories of frontier justice travel around the world. Now stay with me because what happens next will show you why some people should never be underestimated. Big Jack drained the remainder of his whiskey and stood, his considerable bulk casting a shadow across half the saloon floor. The piano player, sensing the shift in atmosphere that always preceded trouble, let his hands fall silent on the keys and quietly slipped toward the back door. Conversations died as other patrons recognized the look in Jack's eyes, the same predatory focus that had preceded a dozen robberies and at least 3 murders in towns across the territory. "Boys," Jack said, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man who had never met meaningful resistance, "I think it is time we introduced ourselves to our new friend and explained the local customs regarding road taxes and hospitality fees. The gang rose as one, their chairs scraping against the wooden floor with the sound of inevitability. They had played this game so many times before that each man knew his role without discussion. Pete would block the door, Carlos would watch the windows, Tommy would keep his hand near his gun, Frank would provide intimidation through sheer size, and Silas would count whatever money they liberated from their victim. It was a well-rehearsed performance that had never failed them, because they had never chosen to target anyone who could fight back. Outside, Clara had reached the saloon doors and paused for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the weathered wood. She could feel the weight of hostile attention from within, the particular quality of silence that meant predators had spotted prey. For just an instant, something flickered behind her tired eyes, something cold and calculating that suggested depths her modest appearance did not reveal. Then it was gone, replaced by the resigned weariness of a woman who simply had nowhere else to go. She pushed through the batwing doors and stepped into the dim interior of the Broken Wheel Saloon, unknowingly walking toward a confrontation that would remind everyone present why legends were born in places exactly like this. The floorboards creaked under Clara's boots as she made her way to an empty table near the far wall, her movements deliberate and unhurried despite the weight of hostile attention that followed her across the room. She chose her seat carefully, positioning herself so that her back was to the wall, and she had a clear view of both the front entrance and the narrow hallway that led to the saloon's rear exit. Old habits died hard, and Clara had learned long ago that survival often depended on the smallest details that most people never bothered to notice. She settled into the rough wooden chair and placed her leather satchel on the table beside her, the brass buckles catching the light from the oil lamps that hung from the ceiling beams. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Murphy whose Irish accent had long ago been worn smooth by years of frontier living, approached with the cautious air of someone who recognized brewing trouble when he saw it. "What can I get you, ma'am?" Murphy asked, his voice pitched low enough that it would not carry to the table where Big Jack and his men sat watching like vultures circling a wounded animal. "Just coffee if you have it fresh," Clara replied, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone who had received a proper education back east, "and perhaps a shot of your best whiskey to go alongside it. I have been traveling for days, and the dust has settled deep." Murphy nodded and retreated to his bar, grateful for any excuse to put distance between himself and what he sensed was about to unfold. He had seen this scene play out too many times before, and it always ended the same way, with someone counting stolen money while someone else lay bleeding on his floor. The only variable was how much of his furniture would get broken in the process. Big Jack rose from his chair with the casual confidence of a man who had never encountered meaningful resistance, his considerable bulk moving with surprising grace as he approached Clara's table. His gang followed in a loose semicircle, their positioning designed to cut off any avenue of escape while maintaining the pretense that this was simply a friendly conversation between neighbors. Pete Hutchins took up position near the batwing doors, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. Carlos Mendez and Frank Wilson flanked the table from opposite sides, while Tommy Fletcher and Silas Grove completed the human cage that now surrounded the lone woman. "Well now," Big Jack said as he reached Clara's table, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent saloon with the kind of false friendliness that preceded violence. "Looks like we have got ourselves a visitor." Jack planted his massive hands on the table and leaned forward, his shadow falling across Clara like a threat made manifest. "You know, ma'am, this here is what you might call a close-knit community. We look out for each other, make sure everyone contributes their fair share to keeping the peace." Clara looked up at him with the kind of polite attention that well-bred women had perfected as a means of dealing with unwanted advances from crude men. "I appreciate the welcome," she said, her hands folded neatly in her lap, "though I am just passing through. I only need coffee and a moment to rest before I continue my journey." "Oh, but that is where you are wrong," Jack continued, his grin widening to reveal those tobacco-stained teeth. "See, passing through costs money around these parts. Call it a road tax, a hospitality fee, whatever makes you comfortable. Point is, nobody travels through Bitter Creek without paying their dues." Murphy returned with Clara's coffee and whiskey, his hands trembling slightly as he set them on the table. The Irishman had developed a keen sense for reading violence over his years behind the bar, and every instinct he possessed was screaming warnings about the woman who sat so calmly in the eye of this approaching storm. As he placed the coffee cup in front of her, he caught sight of her hands for the first time and felt his breath catch in his throat. Clara's hands were not the soft, pampered appendages of a genteel widow. They were scarred and calloused, marked by decades of gripping something that had fought back with desperate fury. The knuckles bore the telltale marks of impact injuries, and a particularly prominent scar ran across her right palm in a pattern that Murphy recognized from his own youth working the docks in Boston. It was the kind of mark left by rope burn, by something braided and strong that had been wrapped around flesh and pulled tight under tremendous pressure. Murphy retreated quickly, but not before catching Clara's eye for just a moment. In that brief exchange, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Behind the polite facade and cultured speech, Clara Morrison was measuring distances, calculating angles, and preparing for war. "I do not have much money," Clara said, turning her attention back to Big Jack while her fingers wrapped around the warm coffee cup. "And I certainly do not have enough to satisfy whatever amount you believe constitutes proper taxation. Perhaps we could discuss a more reasonable arrangement." Big Jack's laughter boomed across the saloon, joined by the snickers and guffaws of his men. The sound held no warmth, no genuine mirth, only the cruel amusement of predators who enjoyed playing with their food before the kill. "Lady, you are sitting there in clothes that cost more than most folks around here make in a month, wearing jewelry that could buy a man a decent horse, and trying to tell me you are broke," Jack said, reaching out to flick the silver locket at Clara's throat with one thick finger. "That there bauble alone would cover your taxes with plenty left over for a generous tip." Clara's hand moved with surprising speed to intercept his wrist before his finger could make contact with the locket, her grip firm enough to stop his motion completely. "Please do not touch that," she said quietly, her voice still carrying those cultured tones, but now underlaid with something that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. "It belonged to my husband, and it is not for sale." For a moment, Big Jack stared down at the slender woman who had dared to lay hands on him, his alcohol-fogged brain struggling to process this unexpected resistance. Then his face darkened with the kind of rage that came from wounded pride, and he jerked his wrist free of Clara's grip with enough force to knock over her coffee cup. The dark liquid spread across the wooden table and began dripping onto the floor in a steady rhythm that sounded unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "You got some nerve, old woman," Jack snarled, his massive hand shooting out to grab Clara's wrist in a grip designed to cause pain and demonstrate dominance. "I think you need a lesson in local manners, and I am just the man to provide your education." Clara made no attempt to pull away from his grip, but something fundamental shifted in her posture. Her spine straightened, her shoulders squared, and her head came up with a kind of regal bearing that suggested she was accustomed to command rather than submission. When she spoke, her voice carried across the room with perfect clarity, each word enunciated with the precision of someone who expected to be obeyed. "Boys," she said, her steel-gray eyes moving from one gang member to another with the kind of assessment that suggested she was cataloging weaknesses and calculating probabilities, "you really do not want to do this. I came here seeking nothing more than coffee and a few minutes of peace. I am asking you politely to step back and allow me to finish my business so that I can continue on my way to my ranch." The mention of a ranch sent fresh waves of laughter through the gang. Tommy Fletcher, his young face twisted with cruel amusement, slapped his knee and shook his head in disbelief. "Your ranch," he said, his voice cracking with barely controlled mirth. "Lady, you look about as suited for ranch work as a canary in a coal mine. What you got? A little flower garden and maybe a chicken coop. Maybe she raises them fancy lap dogs," Carlos Mendez added, the burn scars on his face pulling tight as he grinned. "But she has got herself a whole kennel full of poodles and such." Frank Wilson, whose massive frame dwarfed even Big Jack, leaned forward until his face was only inches from Clara's. "You hear that, city folk," he rumbled in a voice like distant thunder. "These boys think you are playing dress-up, pretending to be something you ain't. Maybe you should stick to what you know best, whatever that might be." Throughout this exchange, Clara remained perfectly still, her wrist still trapped in Big Jack's painful grip, but showing no sign of distress or fear. Instead, she seemed to be listening to something beyond their crude taunts. Her head tilted slightly, as if she could hear distant sounds that escaped everyone else in the room. When she finally spoke again, her voice carried a quality that made Murphy the bartender begin quietly moving his most expensive bottles to safety behind the bar. "I spent 30 years breaking horses that killed their previous trainers," she said, her tone conversational and matter-of-fact. "Mustangs mostly, but also a fair number of stallions that thought they were too proud to serve. Every one of them started out believing they could not be tamed. Every one of them learned different." The casual way she delivered this information, as if discussing the weather or commenting on the quality of the coffee, sent an unexpected chill through the assembled gang members. There was something in her voice, a kind of absolute certainty that suggested she was not making idle threats or attempting to bluff her way out of trouble. Big Jack tightened his grip on her wrist, his knuckles going white with the effort. "Lady," he said, leaning down until his whiskey-soaked breath washed over her face, "I do not know what kind of game you think you are playing, but it ends right now. You are going to empty that fancy purse of yours, hand over that jewelry, and then you are going to thank us for the privilege of contributing to the local economy." Clara looked up at him with those steel-gray eyes, and for just a moment, Big Jack caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. It was not fear or desperation or even anger. It was the kind of cold, professional assessment that a craftsman might give to a particularly challenging piece of raw material. The look of someone calculating exactly how much pressure would be required to break something completely. In the far corner of the saloon, hunched over a bottle of rot-gut whiskey that had been his constant companion for the better part of a decade, sat Ezekiel Hawthorne. Most folks in Bitter Creek knew him simply as Old Zeke, the broken-down cavalry veteran who swept floors for drinks and told increasingly elaborate stories about his service in the Indian Wars to anyone foolish enough to listen. His weathered face bore the permanent squint of a man who had spent too many years staring across hostile territory, and his left leg had never quite healed properly from the Comanche lance that had ended his military career 15 years ago. But Zeke had not always been a drunk, and there had been a time when his eye for horseflesh and his ability to read the subtle language of stance and movement had made him one of the most respected cavalry scouts on the frontier. Even now, dulled by alcohol and disappointment, some part of that old instinct remained sharp enough to recognize what others missed entirely. As Big Jack continued his intimidation of the woman at the corner table, Zeke found his attention drawn not to the gang leader's theatrical posturing, but to the way the woman held herself under pressure. There was something achingly familiar about the way she sat. Perfectly balanced despite the hostile attention, her weight distributed in a manner that suggested she could move in any direction without telegraphing her intentions. It was the posture of someone who had spent countless hours in the saddle dealing with animals that could kill with a single misstep, someone who understood that survival often came down to reading the smallest changes in body language and responding with perfect timing. Zeke squinted harder, his alcohol-fogged mind struggling to place what he was seeing. The woman's age was right, and there was something about the shape of her hands, the way she held her head, that tugged at memories he had thought lost forever. He had seen that particular combination of alertness and controlled stillness before, but it had been so long ago, in a different place and time, when he had been a different man entirely. Then Clara Morrison shifted slightly in her chair, and suddenly Zeke was 20 years younger, standing in the dusty corral outside Fort Robinson, watching in awe as a legend worked her magic on a black stallion that had already put 3 men in the hospital. The posture was unmistakable now that he recognized it. That perfect balance between relaxation and readiness that marked someone who had learned to communicate with 1,500 pounds of barely controlled violence through nothing more than the positioning of her body. "Sweet merciful Lord," Zeke whispered, his words barely audible even to himself. But in the sudden tension that filled the saloon, even whispers carried further than they should have. Big Jack paused in his verbal assault on Clara, his head turning toward the old drunk with irritation. "What did you say, Zeke?" he demanded, his grip on Clara's wrist tightening unconsciously. But Zeke was not looking at Big Jack anymore. His eyes were fixed on Clara with the intensity of a man witnessing a ghost made flesh, and when he spoke again, his voice carried across the room with perfect clarity. "Iron Whip Morrison," he said, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. Dear God in heaven, that is Clara Iron Whip Morrison sitting right there in our saloon. The effect of those words was immediate and electric. Every conversation in the room died completely. Every glass stopped halfway to waiting lips. Every card remained suspended in the air above the table where it had been about to be played. Even the old hound dog that had been sleeping near the stove lifted its head, as if sensing that the world had suddenly become a more dangerous place. Clara looked across the room at Zeke with eyes that held recognition and perhaps a touch of sadness for what the years had done to a man she remembered as proud and capable. "Hello, Sergeant Hawthorne," she said, her voice gentle but carrying easily across the stunned silence. "I wondered if there might be someone here who would remember the old days." Big Jack's grip on her wrist loosened involuntarily as his alcohol-addled brain struggled to process what he was hearing. The name meant nothing to him, but the reaction from the rest of the room suggested that he was missing something important. "Iron Whip," he said, his voice uncertain for the first time since the confrontation had begun. "What kind of fool name is that supposed to be?" But Pete Hutchins had gone white as fresh snow, his hand falling away from his gun, but as if the weapon had suddenly become too hot to touch. "Boss," he whispered, his voice tight with fear, "that there is Clara Morrison. The Clara Morrison. The woman who broke 500 wild Mustangs across 3 territories. The one who worked with Buffalo Bill himself." Carlos Mendez crossed himself reflexively, his burn-scarred face twisting with something approaching religious terror. "She is supposed to be dead," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Killed in a stampede down in Texas, had to be 10 years ago at least." "Retired," Clara corrected mildly, reaching into her leather satchel with her free hand while Big Jack continued to stare at her in growing confusion. "Not dead, just tired of the work. But some skills, once learned, are never really forgotten." What emerged from the satchel was 15 feet of braided leather perfection, each strand woven with the kind of precision that spoke of countless hours of painstaking craftsmanship. The handle was carved from white oak and inlaid with silver wire that formed an intricate pattern of horses running beneath storm clouds. At the very end of the handle, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, were carved the initials T.M. in a flowing script that had been worn smooth by decades of use. Tommy Fletcher, the youngest of the gang, stared at the whip with the fascination of youth confronting legend made manifest. "That ain't possible," he said, his voice cracking with adolescent uncertainty. "My granddaddy used to tell stories about Iron Whip Morrison, but that was back when he was young. She would have to be older than Moses by now." "I am 58 years old," Clara said conversationally, as she stood slowly from her chair, Big Jack's grip on her wrist finally loosening enough for her to pull free without apparent effort. "I started breaking horses when I was 15, worked steady for 30 years, and retired when my husband Thomas was killed trying to gentle a stallion that should have been put down instead of trained. The whip you are looking at has been in my hand for more years than some of you have been breathing, and it has never failed me when I needed it most." As she rose to her full height, something fundamental shifted in Clara Morrison's bearing. The tired widow disappeared completely, replaced by someone who moved with the fluid confidence of a master craftsman preparing to demonstrate her trade. Her shoulders squared, her spine straightened, and her head came up with the regal bearing of someone accustomed to command. Most dramatically, her eyes changed from the mild steel gray of polite attention to something cold and implacable that reminded every man in the room of winter storms and unforgiving horizons. Frank Wilson, whose massive frame had intimidated countless victims in the past, took an unconscious step backward as he met those eyes. "Boss," he said, his voice uncertain, "maybe we should reconsider our position here." But Big Jack, his pride wounded and his authority challenged in front of his men, was not ready to back down from a woman regardless of whatever reputation she might have earned in the distant past. "So what if you used to wave a piece of rope around for a living?" he snarled, though his voice lacked the confident bluster it had carried moments before. "That was a long time ago, and horses ain't the same as men with guns." Clara smiled then, an expression that held no warmth whatsoever but promised a great deal of education for anyone foolish enough to remain enrolled in the lesson she was about to provide. "You are absolutely right," she said, her voice carrying the same conversational tone she had used throughout the confrontation, but now underlaid with something that made the saloon's oil lamps seem to flicker in response. Horses are much more dangerous than men with guns. A horse that wants to kill you has 1,500 pounds of muscle, iron-hard hooves, and teeth designed to crush bone. A horse does not hesitate, does not negotiate, and does not show mercy to anything it perceives as a threat. She let the whip uncoil from her hand, the leather flowing across the floor like a living thing until its full length lay revealed in the lamplight. The braided surface showed the wear of decades of use, but the leather remained supple and strong, maintained with the kind of religious devotion that marked the difference between a tool and a weapon. Men, on the other hand, Clara continued, her eyes never leaving Big Jack's face, can usually be reasoned with. They can be convinced to make better choices, to walk away from situations that will only bring them pain and regret. The question that remains is whether you gentlemen are smarter than the average Mustang, or if I am going to have to provide you with the same kind of education I used to give those horses that thought they were too proud to learn. Big Jack's pride had carried him through 2 decades of bullying and intimidation, and even faced with the growing certainty that he had badly misjudged his target, that same pride now demanded he see the confrontation through to its conclusion. His right hand dropped to the bone-handled Colt at his hip, fingers wrapping around the familiar grip with the confidence of a man who had drawn that particular weapon in anger more times than he cared to remember. The gun had never failed him before, and Jack could not conceive of any circumstances under which a piece of braided leather could prove superior to 6 rounds of hot lead delivered with malicious intent. The revolver had barely cleared leather when Clara's whip sang through the air with a sound like ripping silk, the braided tip moving faster than the human eye could follow. The crack when it connected with Jack's gun hand was sharp and precise, like a tree branch snapping under winter ice, and suddenly the Colt was spinning through the air to land with a metallic clatter somewhere behind the bar. Big Jack stared down at his empty holster in stunned disbelief, his fingers already beginning to swell from the impact that had numbed his entire arm from wrist to shoulder. The whip had returned to Clara's side before Jack's gun hit the floor, coiled and ready with the kind of fluid efficiency that spoke of muscle memory honed by decades of repetition. She had not moved from her position beside the table, had not even shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Yet somehow she had reached across 12 feet of open space to disarm a man whose reputation for quick draws had made him feared across 3 counties. "That was your first lesson," Clara said, her voice carrying the same conversational tone she might have used to discuss the weather, though now every man in the saloon could hear the steel beneath the silk. The lesson was this: speed means nothing without precision, and precision means nothing without practice. I have had 30 years to perfect my craft, and every day of those 30 years taught me something new about the relationship between intention and execution. Pete Hutchins, positioned near the batwing doors, had drawn his own weapon at the first sign of trouble, but now he found himself staring down at the revolver in his hand, as if he had never seen it before. The casual ease with which Clara had disarmed his boss had shaken something fundamental in Pete's understanding of how violence worked. And for the first time in his criminal career, he was beginning to question whether having a gun actually made him dangerous or merely gave him the illusion of danger. Carlos Mendez and Frank Wilson moved to flank Clara from opposite sides, their boots scraping against the rough wooden floor as they tried to position themselves beyond the reach of that impossibly quick leather tongue. Tommy Fletcher backed toward the rear of the saloon, his young face pale with the kind of fear that came from watching childhood stories spring to terrible life. Only Silas Grove remained motionless, his gray-beard face thoughtful as he calculated odds and probabilities with the cold assessment of a professional gambler. "You boys seem to be under the impression that surrounding me will somehow improve your position," Clara observed, her steel-gray eyes tracking each man's movement with the kind of predatory focus that Murphy the bartender recognized from his days watching wolves hunt in packs back in the old country. That is an understandable mistake, but it demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how territory control actually works. She took a single step forward, and suddenly the dynamics of the entire room shifted. The whip in her right hand remained coiled but ready, while her left hand moved to rest casually on the table edge, fingers splayed in a manner that suggested she could push off and move in any direction without telegraphing her intentions. Most importantly, her positioning now gave her clear sight lines to every man in the room, while placing her back to the solid wall where no one could approach unseen. Carlos made his move first, lunging forward with the kind of desperate aggression that had served him well in bar fights and back alley robberies. His thick arms reached out to grab Clara around the waist, confident that once he got his hands on her, the fight would be over regardless of whatever tricks she might know with that braided rope. Carlos had wrestled steers to the ground with his bare hands, and he could not imagine that a woman half his weight could offer any meaningful resistance to his raw physical strength. The whip uncoiled like a striking serpent, 15 feet of leather moving through the air in a perfect arc that wrapped around Carlos's right ankle with surgical precision. Clara's grip on the handle tightened, her scarred knuckles going white as she planted her feet and used leverage and technique to overcome the disadvantage in size and weight. The result was spectacular and immediate. Carlos found himself airborne, his forward momentum suddenly redirected sideways as his feet were swept out from under him with enough force to send him crashing through 2 tables and a chair before he came to rest against the far wall in a tangle of splintered wood and broken crockery. The whip snapped back to Clara's side, leather flowing like water as it resumed its ready position. She had not moved more than 6 inches from her original spot, had not even appeared to exert herself beyond the casual effort one might use to swat a troublesome fly. Carlos groaned and tried to sit up, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead where he had connected with the edge of a table, but his right leg refused to support his weight properly. Carlos always was too eager, Clara commented, as if she were critiquing a student's performance in a riding lesson rather than discussing a man she had just sent flying across a saloon. The key to working with any large, aggressive animal is patience and proper timing. Rush the approach, and you end up on the ground wondering what happened. Frank Wilson, motivated by loyalty to his injured comrade and a growing desperation that made rational thought impossible, charged from the opposite direction with his massive fists raised like hammers. At nearly 300 pounds of solid muscle, Frank had never encountered anything he could not simply overpower through brute force. And even faced with Clara's demonstration of skill, he remained confident that one solid blow would end the confrontation decisively. Clara waited until Frank had committed fully to his attack, his enormous frame barreling toward her with all the grace and subtlety of a runaway freight wagon. Then, with timing that bordered on supernatural, she stepped aside and let the whip fly in a complex maneuver that defied easy description. The leather seemed to move in 3 directions simultaneously, creating a pattern in the air that looked almost like a spider's web made of braided cowhide. When the motion resolved, Frank Wilson found himself wrapped from shoulders to ankles in 15 feet of leather that held him as securely as iron chains. His arms were pinned to his sides, his legs bound together, and every attempt to break free only succeeded in tightening the bonds that held him. Clara held the handle of the whip with one hand while maintaining perfect balance, controlling 300 pounds of struggling man with no more apparent effort than it might take to hold a large fish on a line. The technique you just witnessed is called a running noose wrap, Clara explained in the same conversational tone, though now her voice carried an undercurrent of professional satisfaction that suggested she was genuinely enjoying the opportunity to demonstrate her craft. I developed it specifically for dealing with particularly aggressive stallions, the kind that would try to bite and kick simultaneously while you were attempting to fit them with a halter. The beauty of the technique lies in its self-tightening properties. The harder the subject struggles, the more secure the restraint becomes. Frank's face was turning an alarming shade of purple as he fought against bonds that seemed to tighten with each breath, and Clara must have noticed because she adjusted her grip slightly, allowing him enough slack to breathe while maintaining complete control over his movement. It was a display of precision that left no doubt about her level of skill, a demonstration that she could have crushed the life out of him as easily as she now held him helpless. Tommy Fletcher, the youngest member of the gang, had been slowly backing toward the rear exit throughout the confrontation, his adolescent mind finally accepting what his pride had initially refused to acknowledge. This was not a fight they could win through conventional means, and every second that passed only reinforced the growing certainty that they were dealing with something far beyond their experience or capability. But as Tommy's back touched the rear door, he discovered that retreat was no longer an option. The whip cracked again, this time moving in a horizontal sweep that sent the tip flying across the room to wrap around the door handle with enough force to yank it completely out of Tommy's reach. The door slammed shut with a bang that sounded unnaturally loud in the tense atmosphere, and suddenly the young gunfighter found himself trapped with no avenue of escape. "I am afraid I cannot allow anyone to leave just yet," Clara said, her voice carrying a note of genuine regret that somehow made her words more terrifying than any threat could have been. "You see, gentlemen, you made a choice when you decided to approach my table with demands and intimidation. That choice has consequences, and I am afraid those consequences must be fully explored before anyone goes anywhere." Pete Hutchins, still positioned near the front entrance, raised his revolver with hands that shook despite his best efforts to maintain steady aim. The barrel wavered as he tried to draw a bead on Clara, but she seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, her slight movements making it impossible to acquire a clean shot without risking the lives of his own comrades. "You are thinking about shooting me," Clara observed, somehow aware of Pete's internal struggle despite having her back partially turned to him. "That is certainly an option, though I should point out that your friend Carlos there tried the direct approach and is currently bleeding on my floor. Your friend Frank attempted to use superior size and strength, and he is currently discovering what it feels like to be a fish in a net. Perhaps you might consider whether adding gunplay to this equation will actually improve your situation." But Pete was beyond rational thought now, driven by desperation and the kind of panicked courage that made cornered animals dangerous. He squeezed the trigger, the gunshot thunderously loud in the confined space of the saloon, muzzle flash lighting up the room like lightning. The bullet passed through empty air where Clara had been standing a fraction of a second before, embedding itself in the wooden wall with a solid thunk that sent splinters flying. Clara had moved with liquid grace, her body flowing sideways like smoke as she avoided the shot with the same casual ease she had displayed throughout the confrontation. But now, for the first time since the fight had begun, there was something different in her steel-gray eyes. The polite restraint was gone, replaced by something cold and implacable that reminded everyone present why legends were born in moments exactly like this one. "That," Clara said, her voice still conversational, but now carrying undertones that made the saloon's oil lamps seem to flicker in response, "was a mistake." The echo of Pete's gunshot was still reverberating through the saloon when Clara Morrison reached down and drew a second whip from her boot, this one shorter than the first, but no less perfectly crafted. The handle was carved from black walnut and wrapped in leather that had been stained dark by years of use, while the braided length showed the same meticulous care and maintenance that marked the work of a true professional. Where her first whip had been designed for distance and precision, this secondary weapon was built for close-quarters work, its 10-foot length perfect for the confined space of indoor combat. Big Jack stared at the dual weapons with the growing horror of a man who realized he had stumbled into a situation far beyond his comprehension or capability. Throughout his career of violence and intimidation, he had always been able to rely on superior numbers, better weapons, or simple brute force to overcome any opposition. But Clara Morrison represented something entirely outside his experience. A master craftsman who had turned violence into an art form and refined that art through decades of practice against opponents far more dangerous than any human adversary. "You have got to be kidding me," Jack muttered, his voice hoarse with disbelief as he watched Clara test the balance of both whips with the casual ease of a gunfighter checking his ammunition. "Two of them things. What kind of person carries two whips?" "The kind of person who spent 30 years working with animals that could kill her in a dozen different ways simultaneously," Clara replied, her voice carrying the same conversational tone that had marked her speech throughout the confrontation. "When you are dealing with a Greenbroke stallion that wants to bite, kick, and trample you all at the same time, you learn to keep your options open and your tools ready." She moved into a stance that Ezekiel Hawthorne recognized from his cavalry days, a position that allowed maximum mobility while maintaining perfect balance and control over both weapons. Her feet were placed shoulder-width apart, her weight evenly distributed, and her arms positioned to deliver maximum leverage with minimum telegraphing. It was the fighting posture of someone who understood that survival depended not on raw aggression, but on efficiency, precision, and the ability to control multiple threats simultaneously. Pete Hutchins, his revolver still smoking from the shot he had fired, tried desperately to acquire another target, as Clara seemed to flow like water between the scattered furniture and debris that littered the saloon floor. But every time he thought he had a clear shot, she would shift position with liquid grace, using Frank Wilson's bound form as cover or positioning herself behind an overturned table in such a way that any bullet would have to pass through multiple obstacles before reaching its intended target. The problem with guns, Clara observed as she avoided Pete's increasingly frantic attempts to draw a bead on her, is that they are single-purpose tools designed for a single moment of violence. Once you pull that trigger, you have committed yourself to a course of action that cannot be taken back or modified based on changing circumstances. Whips, on the other hand, offer a much more nuanced approach to conflict resolution. To demonstrate her point, Clara sent her longer whip sailing through the air in a complex figure-8 pattern that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The braided leather moved like a living thing, flowing around chair legs and table edges with perfect precision until it reached Pete's position near the front entrance. The tip wrapped around his gun hand with the delicacy of a spider spinning silk, but when Clara pulled back, Pete's revolver went flying through the air to land in the same general area where Big Jack's weapon had come to rest behind the bar. Pete stared down at his empty hand in shock, flexing his fingers to make sure they were still attached and functional. The whip had struck with such precision that it had disarmed him without causing any injury beyond a thin red mark around his wrist where the leather had made contact. It was a display of control that spoke to decades of practice and an almost supernatural understanding of distance, timing, and leverage. "Now then," Clara said, both whips now moving in slow, hypnotic patterns that kept every man in the room transfixed. "I believe we were discussing the concept of consequences and how certain choices lead inevitably to certain outcomes. You gentlemen made the choice to approach a peaceful traveler with demands and intimidation. When that approach was met with polite resistance, you escalated to physical contact and threats of violence. When those tactics proved ineffective, you resorted to firearms. Each decision has led you deeper into a situation that could have been avoided entirely through the simple expedient of good manners and basic human decency." Silas Grove, who had remained motionless throughout the confrontation while calculating odds with the cold precision of a professional gambler, finally came to the conclusion that retreat was the only viable option. He began backing slowly toward the rear of the saloon, his graybeard face set in the kind of resigned expression that suggested he had finally accepted the reality of their situation. But Clara had been tracking his movement with peripheral vision, and the shorter whip lashed out to wrap around his ankle with the same surgical precision she had displayed throughout the fight. Silas found himself yanked off his feet and dragged across the floor until he came to rest in an undignified heap near the overturned tables where Carlos was still trying to clear his head from his earlier collision with the furniture. "I am afraid no one leaves until this matter is properly resolved," Clara said, her voice carrying a note of genuine regret that somehow made her words more intimidating than any threat could have been. "You see, gentlemen, reputation is a fragile thing. If word gets around that Clara Morrison was robbed by a gang of common thieves in a frontier saloon, it might encourage others to try similar approaches. That would be inconvenient for me and fatal for them. So I prefer to address these situations thoroughly the first time they arise." Big Jack, desperate to reassert some measure of control over a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his comprehension, reached behind his back and drew a small hideout gun from a shoulder holster concealed beneath his vest. The weapon was a double-barreled Derringer, its short range and limited ammunition making it suitable only for close-quarters desperation, but in his panicked state, Jack was beyond rational tactical thinking. Clara spotted the movement before Jack had fully cleared leather, her experience with dangerous animals having taught her to watch for the subtle tells that preceded aggressive action. But instead of immediately disarming him, she allowed him to complete the draw and even raise the weapon in her direction. For a moment, the The saloon held its breath as predator and prey faced each other across the debris-strewn floor. "That is your backup gun," Clara observed with the kind of professional interest that a craftsman might show when examining another artisan's work. "Percussion cap, probably 41 caliber, effective range of maybe 10 feet if you are lucky and sober. Decent choice for a hideout weapon, though the reload time makes it essentially useless once you have fired both barrels." Jack's hand trembled as he tried to maintain steady aim, his alcohol-fogged brain struggling to process the casual way Clara was discussing his weapon while standing directly in its line of fire. "Lady," he said, his voice cracking with strain, "you just stand still now, and nobody else needs to get hurt." But as Jack spoke, his eyes flicked involuntarily toward Murphy the bartender, who had been trying to remain invisible behind his bar throughout the entire confrontation. Clara caught that glance and immediately understood the tactical shift that was taking place in Jack's desperate mind. He was considering taking a hostage, using an innocent bystander as leverage to force her into submission. The temperature in the saloon seemed to drop 10 degrees as Clara's steel-gray eyes went completely cold, all pretense of conversational politeness disappearing like morning mist before a winter sun. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of absolute finality that suggested the time for warnings and second chances had passed completely. "Son," she said, the single word cutting through the tense silence like a blade, "you just made the last mistake of your life." What followed happened so quickly that most of the witnesses would spend years afterward arguing about exactly what they had seen. Both whips moved simultaneously, the longer one sailing high while the shorter one swept low, creating a complex, three-dimensional pattern that seemed to fill the entire space between Clara and her target. Big Jack tried to track the movement, tried to anticipate where to aim, but the braided leather seemed to be everywhere at once, moving with a speed and precision that defied human reaction time. When the motion resolved, Big Jack found himself suspended 3 feet off the ground, held in place by a network of leather that wrapped around his arms, legs, and torso with the complexity of a sailor's knot. The derringer had been plucked from his grasp so gently that he barely felt it leave his hand, and now it rested on a nearby table, well beyond his reach. Most humiliatingly, he was positioned in such a way that his feet dangled helplessly in the air, while the network of whip leather held him as securely as iron chains. "The technique you just witnessed is called a suspension bind," Clara explained, her voice returning to its earlier conversational tone though the coldness remained in her eyes. "I developed it for dealing with stallions that would rear up and try to strike with their front hooves. The key is to control all 4 limbs simultaneously while maintaining enough flexibility in the restraint system to prevent injury to the subject. As you can see, the position is quite secure but completely non-lethal, assuming the subject does not struggle too violently against the bonds." Around the room, the scattered members of Big Jack's gang stared at their suspended leader with expressions of awe and terror. Carlos was still nursing his injured leg and bleeding head. Frank remained wrapped in leather that showed no signs of loosening. Pete clutched his disarmed hand against his chest. Tommy pressed himself against the locked rear door, and Silas lay in his undignified heap among the broken furniture. Not one of them retained any illusion about their ability to continue the fight or challenge Clara's dominance of the situation. Murphy the bartender emerged slowly from behind his bar, his Irish accent thick with emotion as he surveyed the scene of controlled devastation that his establishment had become. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," he whispered, his voice filled with genuine reverence. "In all my years, I have never seen anything like what you just did, ma'am. That was not fighting, that was artistry." Clara nodded acknowledgement of the compliment, while keeping her attention focused on the 6 men who had made the mistake of underestimating what lay beneath her modest exterior. "Gentlemen," she said, both whips now coiled and ready at her sides, "I believe we have reached the point in our conversation where you need to make some important decisions about your future behavior and life choices." The legend of Iron Whip Morrison had just been reborn in the most spectacular fashion possible, and every man in the Broken Wheel Saloon knew they had witnessed something that would be talked about for generations to come. The sound of boot heels on wooden boardwalks announced the arrival of Sheriff William Garrett 15 minutes after the last whip had been coiled and the final gang member secured. Garrett was a tall, weathered man in his early 60s whose badge carried the weight of 30 years spent keeping the peace in towns that tested the limits of human civilization. He had seen every variety of violence that the frontier could produce, from simple bar fights to complex vendettas that spanned generations. But the scene that greeted him inside the Broken Wheel Saloon was unlike anything in his considerable experience. Big Jack Malone hung suspended from the ceiling like a grotesque chandelier, still held in place by the complex network of braided leather that had rendered him as helpless as a fly in a spider's web. His gang lay scattered around the room in various states of defeat. Carlos bleeding and favoring his injured leg, Frank Wilson still bound in leather that showed no signs of loosening, Pete Hutchins cradling his disarmed hand, Tommy Fletcher pressed against the locked rear door, and Silas Grove sitting in undignified silence among the wreckage of overturned furniture. At the center of it all stood Clara Morrison, her two whips coiled neatly at her sides, her steel-gray eyes reflecting the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from a job completed with professional competence. She had straightened her traveling dress and smoothed her graying hair back into its modest bun, once again appearing to be nothing more threatening than a tired widow continuing her journey to destinations unknown. Sheriff Garrett surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to reading the aftermath of violence, noting the precision with which each gang member had been neutralized and the complete absence of any serious injury despite the thoroughness of their defeat. Most tellingly, not a single shot had been fired by the defending party, suggesting a level of skill and restraint that belonged to an entirely different category of combat expertise. "Well now," Garrett said, his voice carrying the dry humor of a man who had learned to find amusement in the most unlikely circumstances, "this here is what I call a professional piece of work. Jack, you and your boys been causing trouble in my town for the better part of 6 months, and I've been trying to figure out the best way to convince you to take your business elsewhere. Looks like the problem has solved itself in a most educational manner." Clara nodded politely to the sheriff, her bearing respectful but not deferential, carrying herself with the quiet dignity of someone who understood the proper relationship between law and order and those capable of enforcing both. "Sheriff Garrett," she said, her voice returning to the cultured tones that had marked her speech before the violence began. "I apologize for the disturbance to your establishment, Mr. Murphy, and to your town, Sheriff. These gentlemen approached me with demands that I felt unable to accommodate, and the situation escalated beyond what any of us might have preferred." Ezekiel Hawthorne, still seated at his corner table with his bottle of Rotgut whiskey, raised his glass in a shaky salute toward Clara before speaking to the sheriff in a voice thick with emotion and alcohol. "Bill," he said, his words slurring slightly but carrying unmistakable reverence, "you are looking at Clara Iron Whip Morrison herself. The woman who gentled more wild horses than any 3 men combined, who worked alongside Buffalo Bill Cody, who trained some of the finest cavalry mounts that ever carried a soldier into battle. I seen her work 20 years ago at Fort Robinson, and I am here to tell you that what she just did to Jack and his boys was artistry of the highest order." Sheriff Garrett's eyebrows rose as he processed this information, his weathered face showing the kind of recognition that came from hearing a name that belonged to legend rather than everyday experience. "Clara Morrison," he repeated slowly, testing the weight of the name against his memories of stories told around campfires and in saloons across the frontier. "I heard tell you were killed in a stampede down in Texas some years back." "Just retired," Clara replied with a slight smile that held more sadness than humor. "Sometimes a woman grows weary of the work, Sheriff, especially when the work takes more from her than it gives back. I have been living quietly on my ranch for the past decade, bothering no one and asking nothing from anyone except the right to be left in peace." Murphy the bartender emerged from behind his bar carrying a fresh cup of coffee, which he placed on Clara's table with the kind of reverent care normally reserved for religious artifacts. "On the house, ma'am," he said, his Irish accent thick with emotion. "And I want you to know that any damage to my establishment is more than paid for by the honor of having witnessed what you just accomplished. That was not violence, that was education, and every man Jack in this room is the better for having seen it." The next hour passed in a blur of testimony and paperwork as Sheriff Garrett documented the incident with the thoroughness that frontier justice demanded. Clara provided a clear and factual account of events, identifying herself fully and explaining the circumstances that had led to the confrontation. The sheriff took statements from Murphy and several other witnesses, all of whom confirmed that Big Jack's gang had initiated the trouble and that Clara had acted purely in self-defense throughout the encounter. When the legal formalities were concluded, Sheriff Garrett supervised the transport of the 6 gang members to his jail, where they would await trial on charges ranging from attempted robbery to assault with a deadly weapon. As they were being led away in shackles, Big Jack paused at the saloon door and looked back at Clara with something that might have been respect mixed with his obvious fear. "Lady," he said, his voice hoarse from his time suspended in the whip restraints, "I want you to know that I ain't never encountered anyone like you in all my years of this business. You could have killed every one of us easy as breathing, but you chose not to. I do not understand why, but I am grateful for it." Clara met his eyes with a steady gaze that held no anger, only a kind of weary acceptance that spoke to the weight of too many similar encounters over too many years. "Because killing you would not have taught you anything," she replied, her voice gentle but carrying absolute conviction. "Violence should be the last resort of civilized people, not the first. What you experienced today was consequences, not revenge, and consequences are meant to educate rather than destroy." After the gang had been removed and the immediate aftermath settled, Clara found herself alone at her table with Sheriff Garrett, who had accepted Murphy's offer of coffee and seemed inclined toward conversation with someone whose reputation had reached legendary status during his own years of frontier service. "If you do not mind me asking, ma'am," Garrett said, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than idle interest, "what brought you to Bitter Creek today? This is not exactly a destination that draws folks of your caliber, if you take my meaning." Clara's hand moved unconsciously to the silver locket at her throat, her fingers tracing the worn surface with the kind of gentle touch reserved for treasured memories. "I am traveling to the cemetery at Willow Springs," she said, her voice soft with the kind of pain that time had dulled but never fully healed. "Tomorrow marks 10 years since my husband Thomas was killed trying to break a stallion that should have been put down instead of trained. I make the journey every year to visit his grave and remember the man who taught me that strength and gentleness are not opposing forces." The sheriff nodded with the understanding of a man who had buried his own share of friends and loved ones, recognizing the particular quality of grief that came from losing someone to the very work that had defined their life together. "That is a hard road to travel alone," he said quietly. "Perhaps," Clara replied, "but it is the road I have chosen, and I find that the walking gets a little easier each year. The pain never fully disappears, but it transforms into something else, something that reminds me why the work we did mattered and why the choices we make echo far beyond our own lives." As evening settled over Bitter Creek, word of the confrontation at the Broken Will Saloon spread through the community with the speed that only truly extraordinary events could achieve. By the time Clara had finished her coffee and prepared to continue her journey, a small crowd had gathered outside Murphy's establishment, drawn by curiosity and the kind of awe that people reserved for witnessing history in the making. Clara emerged from the saloon to find herself facing a collection of townspeople whose expressions ranged from reverent admiration to simple gratitude for the removal of a long-standing threat to their community. Among them stood a young girl of perhaps 12 years, her clothes worn but clean, her eyes bright with the kind of hero worship that the young reserved for those who embodied their deepest aspirations. "Miss Morrison," the girl said, her voice clear and carrying despite her obvious nervousness, "my name is Rebecca Hawthorne, and I am Ezekiel's granddaughter. My pa says you are the finest horse trainer who ever lived, and I was wondering if you might have any advice for someone who wants to learn the trade." Clara studied the young girl with the careful attention she had once reserved for evaluating potential colts, noting the calloused hands that spoke of familiarity with hard work, the straight posture that suggested confidence rather than mere bravado, and most importantly, the quality of respectful attention that marked the difference between genuine interest and idle curiosity. "The most important thing to understand about working with horses," Clara said, kneeling down so that she could speak to Rebecca at eye level, "is that it is never about dominance or force. It is about communication, patience, and earning trust through consistent behavior over time. A horse will teach you more about yourself than you will ever teach it. and the lessons usually come in forms you do not expect. She reached into her travel satchel and withdrew her shorter whip, the black walnut handle worn smooth by decades of use, and placed it gently in Rebecca's small hands. "This was my practice whip," she said, her voice carrying the weight of ceremony and significance. "I used it to learn the basics before I moved on to more complex work. If you are serious about the trade, if you are willing to dedicate yourself to learning proper technique and developing the kind of patience that real mastery demands, then I want you to have it." Rebecca's eyes widened as she accepted the precious gift, her young hands trembling slightly as she grasped the worn leather handle. "Thank you, ma'am," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise I will honor it and learn everything I can." "Practice every day," Clara said, rising to her full height and adjusting her traveling dress for the final portion of her journey. "Start with targets that cannot fight back. Learn to place the tip exactly where you intend it to go, and remember that precision matters more than power. Most importantly, never forget that any skill worth mastering requires years of dedicated practice and the humility to keep learning even when you think you understand everything." The crowd parted respectfully as Clara made her way to where the next stagecoach waited to carry her toward Willow Springs and her annual pilgrimage to Thomas's grave. As she climbed aboard and settled into her seat, she could see Rebecca standing in the gathering darkness, still clutching the practice whip with the kind of reverence normally reserved for sacred relics. Years would pass before Clara Morrison's name was spoken again in Bitter Creek, but the story of what had happened in the Broken Wheel Saloon that day would be told and retold until it became part of the town's founding mythology. Rebecca Hawthorne would indeed dedicate herself to mastering the skills that Clara had begun to teach her, eventually becoming renowned throughout the territory as one of the finest horse trainers of her generation, always carrying that original practice whip and always telling anyone who would listen about the day she met a living legend. The stagecoach rolled out of Bitter Creek as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, carrying Clara Morrison toward whatever destinations awaited her beyond the horizon. But her legacy remained behind, embodied in the young girl who would carry forward the traditions of patience, skill, and respect for the animals that had made the frontier possible, ensuring that the lessons of Iron Whip Morrison would echo through generations yet unborn. If this story of hidden strength and the power of earned respect moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of frontier legends. We bring you stories of courage, justice, and the extraordinary people who shaped the American West every week. Until next time, remember that true strength often comes in forms the world does not expect, and the greatest victories are often won not through violence, but through the wisdom to know when violence is necessary and the skill to apply it with precision and restraint.